Well, hello. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, cornerstone of the landed gentry of Felpersham, likely to be first up against the wall in the coming collapse of humanity, and unashamed pronouncer of words in English. Today we're going to discuss two of my most favourite planes of all time, and in some ways two of the greatest failures of the Cold War, the TSR-2 and the F-111 Aardvark. Now look, put your pitchforks down. It's okay. I think we can back that claim up, not really because of what the aircraft ended up being able to do, or not do in the case of the TSR-2, but because of where they came from, how they were developed, and crucially, when they were developed. Also, the local tax collector has told me I'm not allowed to write down my peasantry as disposable assets because, and I quote, "they're people, you know." My riposte of course I bloody know that, that's what makes them more profitable than sheep, was not considered constructive. Anyway, my useless cousin eldest spawn, Eustace, is a trained accountant, and he tells me that I might be in for something of a nasty tax demand, so I need a lot of views in a hurry, and telling everyone that their favourite fighter bomber was crap should probably do the job. This was supposed to be a quick, short video that would take, 10-15 minutes, and as you can see from the runtime, I've fallen down a couple of rabbit holes. Aside from the rage bait, why talk about these two planes together? Well, they flew for the first time within months of one another. They were actually trying to address almost identical problems, and whilst one of them went into production and the other did not, the technical and political challenges that they faced were, I think, fascinating, much more interesting perhaps than their top speeds or the specific outputs of their engines. So this won't be, as ever with me, a guide to the technical manual. This is the bit in between the lines. So let's get going, shall we? The United Kingdom and the United States are not the same country, contrary to opinions that often get expressed elsewhere. We are not the same people. Indeed, we've been described as two people divided by a shared language. My American cousins enjoy shooting guns, driving around in big trucks, drinking bad beer, and of course, they're cousins. More than this, they like big, technically complicated projects that mate innovation to economic muscle, and the outcome is often astoundingly good. Please see the F-15 for details. When America fails, it tends to do so because political will has failed. Politicians in the United States have no long-term view of the world. They get distracted easily and generally behave like toddlers in a sweet shop full of issues and ideas. Back on this side of the pond, we enjoy drinking crap European beer, having very little sex, and telling one another about how shit everything is all the time, even when it isn't. See the Harrier program as a for instance of that. We tend to take intellectual know-how and mate it to badly funded and poorly run programs that then massively overspend versus the initially quoted price, and things get cancelled as a result. When perhaps the British and the Americans come together, culturally at least, it is in our ability to imagine golden ages of times past that never really existed. We look back on the past with rose-tinted nostalgic views of what actually happened. Put it this a different way. In the fitness world, there are two types of fun. Type 1 fun is something that you enjoy straight away. I don't know, like a chocolate bar or kicking Nigel Farage in the bollocks. And then there's type 2 fun, something like, climbing a mountain in a thunderstorm or listening to the latest Radiohead album. At the time, you're sweating, scared, wet, and probably crying, but looking back on it, you realise that you enjoyed it a great deal and you might do it again. In many ways, the TSR-2 is seen in Britain as the one that got away. It slipped through our fingers. It could have been a world beater. In the United States, the F-111 is seen as an amazing aircraft capable of ridiculously high speeds and feats that no other plane could perform. And there is some truth to both of these views, but the development of a long-range, multi-domain nuclear strike aircraft was very much Type 2 fun for those involved. Let's start with the basics. In the mid to late 1950s, why would you want a long-range, multi-domain nuclear strike aircraft? After all, if you were the Americans, you had the new supersonic B-58 Hustler or the new B-52. If you were British, you had access to the V-Force bombers. There was the Hadley Page Victor, probably the most beautiful heavy bomber ever made, and the rugged and terrifying Avro Vulcan. Or, I guess if we want to be honest, there was also the Vickers Valiant, the sort of ugly mad sibling who gets locked in the attic in childhood and ignored however much scratching there is on the loft door. These were, on paper, strategic bombers capable of huge ranges with massive bomb bays that could drop whatever the fuck they wanted from as high as they fucking wanted on anything they fucking wanted while being based from wherever in the world that they fucking wanted. We're skipping ahead a little bit here, but later in its career, in 1982, the Vulcan bomber set the record for the world's longest-range bombing mission ever by flying from Ascension Island in the south of the Atlantic down to the Falklands and bombing the runway at Port Stanley. It was a round trip of 7,500 miles, and they did it 5 times. I mean, they missed, But hey, if I've learnt one thing about strategic bombers in the last couple of years, it's that they always miss. And like the Buff or the Vulcan was supposed to be lobbing H-bombs around, which had megaton yields that could level central Paris. Obviously Moscow, not Paris, Moscow. So if you had a CEP of plus minus a few feet, really wasn't something to worry about particularly. The point here is, if your business was thinking about how the RAF could reach out and Commonwealth someone, or you were in the United States Air Forces and you wanted to provide some kind of kinetic freedom from the skies, then you were, in theory, spoilt for choice. At least you were until 1959. In October that year, the world was put on notice that things had changed. A Martin B-57, based on the British English Electric Canberra bomber, was shot down over China by an SA-75, basically an export version of the SA-2 guideline. Worse was to come, much to everyone's collective shock, and one imagines to Gary Power's specific consternation. In 1960, the Soviets finally managed to shoot down a U-2. Yes, it had taken 14 shots. Yes, they'd been trying for ages to do it. But now that they'd done it, they could do it again pretty much at will. Powers had been at about 70,000 feet, far above the realistic ceiling of most heavy bombers at the time, which forced an immediate rethink of the entire doctrine of both the UK and US bombers. Early SAMs weren't exactly precision weapons, achieving lethality through volume, but they were pretty cheap, and it was assumed, probably rightly, that the Soviets could stick dozens of them around pretty much any target of their choice. Worse still, rumours were beginning to circulate in intelligence circles about an automated system that interlinked interceptors and the SAMs on the ground to create a nightmare environment for any aircraft trying to operate at height if the balloon went up. This meant that low flying was the only way forward for the bombers. The thing with flying up high is that the air is pretty smooth. Most jet engines tend to trip along quite happily, and they can be both quick and efficient at the same time. This is why, when you take your holidays to Costa del Brava or Florida or wherever the working classes goes these days, the plane, even if it is cheap and Irish, flies at about 35,000 feet-ish. The air is smooth, the strain on the airframe is less. If the pilot has had too many whiskies with their morning coffee and things do go sideways, there's plenty of time to recover. Navigation up high is simpler because you can see stuff, and even if that's just the stars above you. On military aircraft, of course, whipping along at supersonic speeds is much easier up there, and obviously there's a defensive advantage too. You can detect things that are coming your way, either electronically or using the Mach 1 eyeball. All lovely stuff. None of these things are true down on the deck. Below about 1,000 feet at Mach 1 or more, everything has to be instant, precise and perfect, or you get to redecorate a few square miles of somebody's country with expensive machinery, body parts and flaming engine components. Gusts and turbulent air are a constant issue, with thermals and unexpected winds that swirl around the airframe, making it an incredibly bumpy ride, especially over hills. Reaction times shrink to the edge of human ability. Realistically, flying low and fast, especially when pushing beyond Mach 1, means automating as much as possible. And just trying to find the target down there is an utter arsehole, as your field of vision is so much more constrained, as is your room for manoeuvre. And if you're unlucky, you'll come across that most dreaded of low-altitude animals, the helicopter. So you'll want a nice clear canopy through which you can raise the middle finger at them as you zoom past. Right, okay, maybe that last is just me, but everybody else is going to want that nice clear canopy so you can see what the terrain is doing. B-52 crews who'd started to try and adapt to this new order of things reported that it was a bit like being put into a washing machine on a spin cycle, potentially for hours at a time. Vomiting, tinnitus, being knocked about by the stowage, black eyes from whacking your head on things, all were occupational hazards. Getting up and manoeuvring around the aircraft was not an option. The Buff did not, and still does not, really love having to fly down low. Massive strengthening was needed to make it viable. Neither, as it turned out, did the V-Force enjoy this much. The Valiant immediately noped out and was withdrawn. I mean, look at it, that thing is supposed to be taking luxury cruises around the Caribbean, not flying like some hooligan stolen it at fuck-all feet. The beautiful Victor coped for a bit, but it started to develop cracks in its wing spars and it became a tanker instead. Of the V-Force, only the Vulcan could really cope down here, but it was not quick. It required a huge amount of strengthening, and really, these big birds were not the answer. They just weren't up to it. Also, and contrary to what Curtis LeMay and the lads in Strategic Air Command might have been telling everybody, the next war was actually highly unlikely to be World War III. Much more likely it was going to be something conventional, and we'd learnt that from the Suez Crisis, the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the Korean War, the Malayan Emergency, the wars in Indonesia, that all show that conventional precision, high-speed bombing had an important role to play. In other words, both the British and the Americans needed a setting between peace and bunny rabbits and all-out nuclear Armageddon. Okay, so if we need an aircraft to do a job, we need to start with the British, because they began to think about this a little earlier, thanks to a prick the Minister of Defence in April 1957, a chap called Duncan Sandys, a man who I personally hope has a special circle of hell reserved for him, where he's repeatedly rogered with a full-size blue steel missile. He released a thing called the White Paper on Government Spending on Aviation, which basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here but not by much, you guys are all fucked, we're spending no more money on new planes, we'll defend the United Kingdom with nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missiles, we'll attack the enemy with nuclear-tipped ICBMs, and basically all we need the RAF to do is to ferry about 5 troops around. The effect of this big-brained thinking was the gutting of the United Kingdom's aviation procurement over the next 12 months, and arguably it was the death knell of our military-industrial complex as a whole. The Mach 3-capable Avro 730 was cancelled, the Hawker Siddeley supersonic VTOL aircraft was cancelled, the SR-53 rocket-firing thingy, which was actually flying already, was cancelled, the Fairey Delta 3, which was basically a British Mirage, but if you tell anybody I said that I'll thump you, was cancelled, and so on and so on and so on. There were many dead bodies on the floor. Only 3 projects were allowed to avoid the axe. The NA-39, which is the Royal Navy's procurement for a carrier-borne strike bomber, the English Electric's supersonic P-1 project, which would result in my beloved Lightning, and something else. A proposed supersonic tactical bomber under the name General Operating Requirement 339, or GOR 339, which was launched in May 1957, a month after that white paper. The RAF was asking for a Mach 2 capable aircraft that could fly up high and then get down to 1,000 feet at Mach 0.9, operate from forward bases and potentially do VTOL stuff. Oh, also it could drop nukes, conventional stores, had 2 crew, and would have a range of not less than 1,000 nautical miles. This was not simple stuff. In practical terms, the Sandys report meant that the huge UK aviation industry had only one project that they could still bid for, and there was likely to be only one winner, and the rest of them would go to the wall financially. This was fine with the Ministry of Supply, who was overseeing the process. They saw the aviation industry as messy, overlapping, bloated, and generally not fit for their nice, neat Keynesian view of economics. They really didn't care about what GOR 339 made, provided that it helped them to rationalise the industry into groups of obedient manufacturing. Britain's leading engineering companies were given until the 1st of January 1958 to respond, and told in no uncertain terms that anyone that was planning to tender on their own was highly unlikely to be successful. Moreover, bidders would have to prove that they had an independent civil project on the go, that they were financially stable, that they had a long technical track record, and that they could take on a big challenge like this, and also that they could be viable long-term without government subsidy. The subtext from Whitehall was merge or die, and if you're small, well, just die then. None of these selection criteria, you'll notice, had anything at all to do with the plane that might come out of the other end. The RAF, on the other hand, very much did care about what came out of the other end, and they were very worried by the Sandys paper. They were concerned that the Ministry of Supply might treat this as just an on-paper exercise to do planned economy stuff without ever actually producing an aircraft, and they came close to a low-key mutiny. They launched something which they called Operation Prospect 2, a sort of engage with the public week in London in 1958 on the future of the Air Force. Here, senior commanders said in a loud and clear voice, "Gosh, we really do need a new supersonic strike bomber. Oh my god, how we accidentally invited the entire press corps to hear that? How careless of us. Never mind. Anyway, we really do need a supersonic bomber." This did not endear them to the Right Honourable members of the Houses of Parliament, but it did ensure that GOR 339 was more than a requirement exercise and would go on to become a solid procurement process. Meanwhile, over in the US, the new Republican F-105 Thunder Chief was looked upon as basically having filled the gaps that the British had identified in capability. On paper, this was a Mach 2 capable bomber. It was designed for low-level penetration with a decent range and nuclear option. Once its radar had been upgraded to the D version, it should have really been most things that the GOR 339 was asking for. There was just one small fly in the ointment. The F-105 was, in fact, crap. Like, really crap. To start with, building the bloody thing was proving to be a complete nightmare of delays for Republican. They had issues all over the place, which resulted in the D version actually entering service before the A version, which is never a good sign. More program delays, problems, and creeping realizations that it really wasn't up to snuff meant that the USAF decision-makers had little choice than to consider what would come next, even before the 105 had been made operational. Probably just as well, given the ass-pounding it got in Southeast Asia over the next couple of years. That left them searching around for what was next. It was very unclear to me whether or not the USAF was aware of GOR 339 specifically, but when their specific operational requirement 183, or SOR 183, broke cover in late 1959, it looked very, very similar indeed. Both 339 and 183 wanted a 1,000 nautical mile range at cruise. The British wanted a 400 nautical mile mission to be flown down at below 1,000 feet at about Mach 0.9. The Americans wanted that to be a bit shorter and a bit faster at 300 nautical miles and at Mach 1.2, but basically it needed to go low and fast as part of the mission profile, get in and come out again. To do that, they both wanted fully automated terrain-following capabilities. Forward basing at runways of less than 3,000 feet, that the aircraft should be able to cruise at 60,000 feet or higher, and capable of greater than Mach 1.8 when it was up there. It would need a two-man crew, a sensor suite for low-down navigation, it must operate in all weathers and all environments, and should be able to operate anywhere in the world. Both initially also included VTOL requirements, and we mentioned that a minute ago about the British one, and both in the end decided to run away from vertical takeoff and landing because it was just so technically complicated and the costs went up. So we'll kind of skip it. It's beyond noting that there was this thing that was put forward at one point. This is the British short version. It's kind of cool and totally weird. And look, we're going to skip it, but it's cool. Let's just note that it was there. A bit like the political interference from Whitehall in the UK, the US famously suffered its own seismic shift in defence procurement with the arrival in the White House of the Kennedy administration, and one man in particular, Robert McNamara. Now, it's often noted that McNamara was the former CEO of Ford, and he was a systems analyst guy, a guy who knew about cars and marketing, basically. And that is true, that was his background. But he was a hell of a lot more than that, too. He'd been a senior strategy advisor to Curtis LeMay for almost the whole of the Second World War. When they were based in Europe together, he'd helped to analyse why so many aircrew aborted and what to do about it, giving LeMay very clear data to act on. I mean, a decent escort fighter might have helped, but what the hell do I know? Anyway, when they were together in India in 20th Bomber Command, McNamara had figured out how to get the B-29s and their fuel over the Himalayas, or the hump as it was known, to bomb Japan in the most efficient way possible. When they shifted over into the Pacific, McNamara helped to analyse the problem of the jet stream over Japan in 1945 and was part of the tiny clique who launched Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo, without explicit approval from Washington, and in so doing probably killed 100,000 people. What? I never said he was a nice man, I just said that he knew about more than selling cars. McNamara came into office believing, much as the British civil service did, that the aerospace industry was incestuous, corrupt, overmighty, and costing the taxpayers a fortune. And, like the civil service, he did kind of have a point. The US aerospace companies absolutely had offered bribes, falsified reports, created make-work projects, and skimmed off the top, bottom, middle, sides, and anywhere else that they could on military programs since the 1940s. Boeing in particular was notorious for quoting at an incredibly low price at the start of a project and then bringing them in late and massively over budget. In fact, defence procurement as a whole was averaging an overspend of 400% over the original ticket price, and in some cases well over 1,000%. And this was a real fucking problem. Moreover, as he looked across the USAF and USN's various requirements, he became completely convinced that there were synergies that could be created by procuring a single platform to do more than one job. After all, he was looking at the F-4 Phantom, which was kind of doing that already. Both the USN and USAF appeared to want a long-range, twin-seat, multi-domain supersonic aircraft with a big radar, advanced electronics, and decent stores load. So why not put them together? And so in 1961 he created a joint program which became known as TFX, or Tactical Fighter Experimental. There would be a TFX-A for the Air Force and a TFX-N for the Navy. This plan was A, fucking stupid, and B, not what either armed force actually wanted. The Navy predominantly needed a long-range fighter aircraft for fleet defence, and the United States Air Force primarily needed a long-range strike aircraft capable of dropping conventional and nuclear weapons a long way away from wherever it was based. Now, both aircraft might be called on to do a little bit of the opposite role, but that was categorically not what either aircraft was actually about, so the overlap was much smaller than McNamara had realised. Worse, he decided that the generals and admirals were too close to industry, and so he imposed something called the Special Air Force Procurement Office for TFX, basically to handle the requirements gathering from USAF and USN, and then to handle the commercials with industry, acting as a personal firebreak, effectively. This breaking of the connection between the customer and the supplier is never very smart, even if it did risk corruption, and by excluding the generals and the admirals, McNamara ensured their undying hostility to the program. The United States Navy, as is often the case, was a little bit smarter than the United States Air Force. Rather than simply opposing the program, they enthusiastically appeared to be embracing it, adding more and more specifications and requirements to get it just right for exactly what they wanted. And for example, they demanded side-by-side seating, an escape capsule, not ejection seats, an arbitrary weight limit, a length limit, but also a massive radar that would need to go in the nose, ensuring that that length limit was next to impossible to achieve, integration with theoretical weapons that they hadn't got yet, and so on and so on and so on. Spoilers here, eventually the F-111B, as it would be known, was cancelled and replaced by the Navy's own program, something called VFX, which resulted in the Tomcat, and weirdly, almost all of these requirements disappeared in a puff of smoke. Now look, what I'm not going to do is go through an extensive account of exactly how the procurement process was run. Essentially, we can shortcut that by saying that there were two competitive bidders. One was Boeing, who'd never built a fighter before, and the other was General Dynamics, who'd never built anything for the Navy before, although they had at least recruited Grumman onto their team. Boeing's 818 TFX was avowedly designed around the Air Force's requirements and bolted the Navy demands on only grudgingly. They came in cheaper in 3 rounds of procurement, but McNamara and his team, probably rightly, didn't believe the quote. And as the 818 only had 50% of shared parts across the A and the N models, they were eventually eliminated. In hindsight, actually, this was probably just as well. They proposed to power the aircraft using a pair of General Electric MF295 engines, which were, well, should we call them new, in that they didn't actually exist yet. And their final submission had a pair of air intakes sort of mounted on the dorsal, above the fuselage, and the idea of this was to stop crap getting sucked in when they were operating at forward air bases, which is sensible on paper. But due to issues with the way that GE had developed their engines, Pratt & Whitney TF-30s were picked instead, and it turned out, much later in testing, that these were highly prone to stalls due to high-speed air getting into the intakes too quickly, a problem that the 818, with its shoulder-mounted intakes, almost certainly would not have been able to fix without basically starting again in 1965, but I'm skipping ahead. One requirement that we haven't really discussed, which was very different in the US, was the idea of using variable geometry, or if you prefer swing wings, for the TFX program. Now, in theory, this could allow an aircraft to have what was called dual domain or multi-domain roles. Basically, you could fly up high with your wings swept back, all sleek, and go really quick. When you got down low, you bring your wings forward, and that would allow you to operate from much shorter runways at lower speeds. Things like landing on the carrier deck might become easier. It would make flying in thicker air less damaging, plus it offered more space for stores. All goodness. The downside was that no one had really done it before, and it was hellishly complex. Using research originating, ironically, from Vickers' cancelled Swallow program, NASA had proved the concept of swing wings which pivoted at the edge of the fuselage, keeping a constant centre of gravity, which at least made it look like on paper that the concept was viable. But a lot of people looked at this and decided it was only marginally helpful, including Ian Grumman. Basically, you got massive weight, complexity and servicing problems, as well as reliability issues when you put swing wings in, which cancelled out any benefit you got, and that's why there aren't a lot of them flying today. It does look sick as fuck though, so there is that. What this meant in practice though was that TFX responses in 1961 looked, well, all rather similar. The sheer level of pressure that the Ministry of Supply had created on the industry as a whole generated a plethora of very interesting designs, which I can only put down to rampant drug use in the aviation industry, which I'd previously been unaware of. For example, this is the Bristol Type 204, and what you'll notice there is that canard is actually set off to one side. It's basically like an aerofoil on an aircraft, with a ramjet sort of intake at the top there, which was designed to push air directly into the engine, very much like the Boeing 818 entry into the F-111 program, except there was no way that was ever going to work, because you'll notice, for example, that there's no shock cone on the back of it, and it was rapidly put to one side. And then you had the de Havilland entry. Essentially what they'd done there is read the spec, have no idea what on earth to put forward, and thought, what if Mosquito, but with jet engines on it? And then, of course, you had entries from English Electric. They'd been part of the Canberra program, and so they'd been aware for some time that they were going to need to come up with some options. And instead of putting forward one aircraft, they actually put forward 5 or 6 aircraft, including this thing. That's a lifting platform at the bottom there. We had it up on the screen previously. So the idea was this lifting platform thing, which has got about 28 engines in it. Pilot Officer Timmy there sat at the back underneath the jet engine of the TSR-2, which he wouldn't be able to hear when it fired up because the noise of those engines would be so unbelievably loud. But nonetheless, the idea was this was going to lift up the TSR-2, launch it into the air, and then at the other end catch it and bring it back down again. I remind you that there were no computers involved in this process, so Pilot Officer Timmy would be flying that presumably with both hands, both feet, and the teeth.
And then you had offers from things like Vickers, who came up with a relatively sensible option. It looks pretty straightforward and actually winds up looking a little bit like what was eventually adopted. But in between it, you have things like this, which is the Fairy offering. That's got two giant engines hanging down underneath, a la the Hustler, but with a sort of weird delta wing thing going on. Again, it looks a little bit like what was eventually adopted as the final design. And where would we be if we didn't include Barnes-Wallis in a group of lads in sheds? This is the Swallow. Now, technically speaking, I'm cheating a little bit here because although it was brought forward during the course of the design program, it wasn't ever actually officially entered. But let's just look at that. Those are swing wings, and on the tip of them, then, you've got these jet engines. To my knowledge, no one has ever attempted anything like this again, and probably for very good reason. Nonetheless, in the end, they got this down to just 2 entries.
So we need to have a quick word about technology before we go any further. I'm old, this feels pretty damned obvious to me, but maybe for some of my younger audience, I should point out that we are talking about an age when almost all of the basic technologies that we take for granted day to day simply did not exist, or if it did exist, it was incredibly primitive. 10% of the US population in 1959 didn't have access to electricity as the British were drawing up the final designs for their TSR-2. The wait time for a landline in the UK, that's a landline telephone, was 3 years. 1 in 4 people didn't have phones in the US still. The first satellite didn't launch until 1957, so there was nothing remotely like GPS, even in conceptual terms. Computers were things that a handful of specialists would use in a university or maybe a library, and they had no displays. The Leo was the first business computer in the world in 1951, and when it was completed 2 years later, it had a memory capable of holding a whole 35 words. The humble IBM PC was 30 years into the future. Putting information on a screen was simply unheard of, but if you wanted to try, then you needed to know that TVs were huge, hot, and broke constantly, as well as being still pretty rare, certainly in the UK. And I mention all of this because some of what both TSR-2 and the F-111 was trying to do required the most advanced computers ever conceived of, and proposed to fly them at supersonic speeds, down low, where the buffeting and turbulence would be horrific, keep them there for a protracted time, and expect them to work perfectly every time. In case you're not following, it was one thing to strap a bloody great big engine to an airframe and make it go quick. It was quite another to fly, navigate, and target, and then hit that target, and then escape, using computer controls down low. All these things needed a shit ton of electronics which simply didn't exist and would need inventing for the programs. The TSR-2 and F-111 projects were probably the first military jets that needed at least as much thinking about the onboard systems as they did about traditional engineering, and they marked the first steps into an automated systems world that we find so ubiquitous today. The potential mission profile, which honestly remained a bit confused really for the whole lifetime of both projects, and indeed for the operational life of the F-111, looked something like this. Take off from a rough forward airbase anywhere in the world, by day or by night, climb to medium or possibly high altitude, cruise there at a high Mach number to make interception difficult or potentially to ferry, and then at the edge of Soviet radar range, wherever the hell that was decided to be, you dive down to less than 1,000 feet, which was later amended to 200 feet, plink along as close to the sound barrier as possible, probably for an extended period, find the target, bomb the target with a tactical nuke or a conventional weapon, maybe shoot something down along the way in or out, and then fly home. And if this was going to be on a carrier, actually you needed to think about loiter time high up and then go super fast, and then clearly it had to be land safely on the carrier, which meant it needed to get really slow in the approach. Plus you had all the fun handling stuff that carriers require, like maximum deck space and weights for the lifts. In other words, this plane had to be a Swiss Army knife. All these requirements had huge implications on the engineering. The British team who eventually won the TSR-2 contract, and we'll talk about them in a minute, came up with what they thought of as a systems wish list right very early in the project. Their machine needed to fully automate terrain following capabilities, and that would be based on a forward-looking radar, or an FLR. Then it would need to have a separate set of Doppler radars that looked down and checked height on a regular basis, and cross-reference that with the FLR. An automatic flight control system would then need to actually fly the plane automatically, and a maneuver computer supported by bleeding-edge internal reference systems, or IIS, would need to guide the course, itself made up from super-sensitive gyros and accelerometers, all measured by voltage and commands from the computing unit. Even if GPS had existed, the RAF demanded that the aircraft be self-contained, as did the USAF, and it would need to rely on internal systems, not external guidance. To correct for any errors in the IRS, the aircraft needed to be able to get regular fixes from known points along a pre-programmed route, meaning it would also need some kind of side-looking radar, or SLR, and these fixes would then be fed into the IRS, and then the FLR and the IRS would be slaved to a central computing system, or CCS, which would be updated in real time in the cockpit and then recalibrated as needed, and obviously displayed to the pilots in the process. 4 seconds would be taken from a skilled aviator to look down, acquire the information that they needed from a control panel, and then look back up at the terrain. And this was unacceptably long at that kind of speed, at that kind of height. So a heads-up display would be needed, and since no such thing existed in the world at the time, it would need to be built from scratch. The weapons officer, who would also be navigating, would be being thrown around at the back, and it would make it impractical for him to be able to push buttons on a panel. So some kind of remote input would be needed. Effectively, what they were trying to create was a mouse pointer before a mouse pointer was a thing. So they decided to use a hands-on throttle and stick system, minus the throttle, which again did not yet exist, on a moving map, which had never been done before. Meanwhile, a second computer in the CCS would be responsible for delivering the weapons on the target based on these navigational inputs, and then for escaping rapidly, especially if the weapon that was being used was likely to have some emissions of some kind. And that meant using a variety of pre-programmed maneuvers based on the threat profile and weapon types. It was then expected that it might be necessary to exchange pleasantries with some of the locals, thus an air-to-air weapon capable of jump-up launching, that is, being fired and engaging targets coming from above, would also be required, along with compatibility with a cross-section of NATO munitions, both real and planned. And then the pista resistance you needed in a world of electronic warfare and SAM missiles, your own ECM or electronic countermeasures built into the airframe itself, capable of rapid replacement and change given the speed of innovation in that field. And I remind you once again that none of the compute we take for granted today existed, so all of this would need to be worked out with drawings and slide rules. Actually, all of this was true for the TFX aircraft too a couple of years later, and although technology had moved on a little bit, it also needed to be able to cope with swing wings and have a pure air-to-air mode for fleet defence, and of course be able to land and take off from a carrier. Both airframes would need to cope with Mach 2 flight at height, a speed that would cause serious issues for most alloys then in use. It would need a cockpit which could also cope with that kind of speed, which didn't exist. You would then need to think about the engines. These needed to be turbofans to give the range. Then you need to put a reheat on them, which no one had done yet. And then you needed to find a way to suck supersonic air in, but slow it down enough so that the engines could burn it without stalling. And you needed to do all of that with unheard of fuel economy. To deliver the performance and the range, both aircraft would need fanatical focus on weight and miniaturization of components, especially the carrier-capable F-111B. This in turn had really serious commercial implications in the way that the programs were managed and run. Aircraft up to this point had been priced by weight, so let's say you get a £30,000 plane, you'd be able to work out it cost X per pound of weight. Reduce the weight, reduce the cost. But with miniaturization and computerization, the cost actually went into reverse because it cost more to make the plane lighter for the first time, a fact that neither Washington or Whitehall ever really got their heads round. This was, in other words, a complete moonshot. I just feel like, as we talk about these planes, we should acknowledge just how unbelievably ambitious both the TFX and TSR2 projects were, which goes a long way to explaining why they both proved so damned hard to get into service. The bidding processes for both TSR2 and TFX were a bit of a bloody muddle. Two frontrunners emerged pretty quickly as the best option for OR339, both technically and according to the Ministry of Supply, now the Ministry of Aviation's weird rules. Firstly, there was Vickers, with a healthy commercial business in the VC-10 airliner, a track record of miniaturization and guided weapons, a long history, and a design, the P517 that had been put forward. They looked strong. And then there was English Electric, with their long track record of making fridges and vacuum cleaners and light bulbs and fuck knows what else, as well as aircraft. Plus they had the P1 contract, so they'd actually done supersonic stuff recently. Oh, and the P17 that they put forward was pretty cool, even if they refused to name a price for the finished product. In fact, EE never once told the Ministry what they thought the aircraft would cost, insisting on a finished specification from the RAF first, something that they never actually got. But support for the project, even at this early stage, was pretty shaky. So whilst the Ministry was pulling together bidding parties and trying to refine its specifications in early 1958, it was also talking on the quiet to Republic about a British engine version of the 105, or even the North American AJ3 Vigilante, which just fucking no. And these rumours got back to the bidding party's management teams, who began to wonder whether or not this project was actually serious or not. The ministry then made things infinitely worse by convening a meeting in London at which they basically told both Vickers and English Electric that they had won, noting that they preferred the English Electric P17 technically over the Vickers P571, but they preferred the Vickers management team. Both companies heard exactly what they wanted and not what they didn't, and assumed that they were the prime contractor. EE never really adjusted to being a subcontractor to Vickers, who never really recognised the abilities of EE's technical team until it was basically too late. Meanwhile, both Vickers and English Electric had selected the Medway Rolls-Royce turbofan engine, the first in the world with a proper reheat function. The ministry, however, had other ideas. Wanting a competitor to Rolls for reasons that make absolutely zero sense given all their other actions, the ministry instructed Bristol to merge with Armstrong Siddeley in exchange for the TSR2 engine contract. This they duly did, forming BSEL, and Vickers and English Electric were told that they couldn't have the Rolls-Royce engines that they wanted to use. They needed to use BSEL's proposed R15 Olympus engines instead. Problem solved by Whitehall. What? Engineering? What's that? Never heard of it. Never mind. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what happened when you let central planners try and do innovation. All this took time, and the men at the ministry were very tired and crotchety, and their mood was not helped by the Navy, whose project, free of this stupidity, was moving along very nicely indeed, thank you. The Blackburn NA-39 banana bomber, as it became known, was doing a really irritating thing by zooming around the skies of Yorkshire full of joy, proving that it was both real, cheap, and available in basically any quantity that the RAF might so choose. Continuing the RAF's policy of making friends and influencing people, they then launched a vicious behind-the-scenes fight in which they suggested to the Treasury that the Navy should be rendered obsolete by OR339, and therefore the NA-39 should be scrapped, as should the Navy's carriers, and all their money should be given to the RAF to fund this new bomber. Problem solved. Except, if you start a knife fight, always kill your opponent, because in doing this they made a blunt enemy of Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of the Defence Staff, and he played dirty. Nonetheless, in November of 1958, OR339 was approved and the programme became official with the name TSR2 on the 1st of January 1959. From the off, English Electric and Vickers squabbled over every decision. The wing size and shape, the body size, the tailplane size, shape and location, what room should be made for the electronics within the body of the aircraft, what heat should be stored, why putting a saddle tank over the engines might be a bit dangerous, whether or not short takeoff was a serious requirement, how to run cabling through the airframe, how big weapons bay should be, what building materials should be used for what bits, how the undercarriage should fold and how large it should be, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. This basically came down to whether or not the engineers thought that the P17 or the P571 was the best, and unsurprisingly, that basically came down to who had come from Vickers and who had come from EE. This was not helped by the fact that they were in the process of merging with each other, which meant that everybody was fighting for their jobs. Eventually, they came up with a blended, what they called datum design to meet OR339. The problem was that OR339 was now dead, being replaced by Operational Requirement 343, or OR343, itself under constant review and change. And the aircraft now needed to go faster, up beyond Mach 2, and do that up high, and then fly lower, down to 200 feet automatically, and a bit quicker. You need to be able to sprint now over the sound barrier on a regular basis, and you need to do all of this with no impact on the fuel range. This was, in fact, a pretty huge technical change that the RAF and the Ministry tried to pretend was no change at all. These requirements needed significant re-engineering, and further fighting within the management started. None of them at this point had the power to veto, and there was no mechanism established either by the Ministry of Aviation or the RAF to arbitrate. The newly merged businesses, which became known as the British Aircraft Company, or BAC, was terrified of asking for a reduction in the technical demands because the technical complexity justified the TSR2's existence, which they were constantly having to defend. The Ministry, on the other hand, kept hearing assurances from industry that everything that they asked for could be done, and they then allowed the RAF to add in these new features without really consulting anyone. Because of the three companies one cup thing, meetings regularly had more than 40 people in them, and no decision-making ability. Muddling along was very much the order of the day within BAC, but when you started to look outside, it got even worse. The Air Ministry was the senior government department, technically in charge of everything with wings, so it was in charge of this project and everything else beneath it. Beneath that you had the Ministry of Aviation, which technically ran the RAF, and beneath that you had BAC, all of whom had inputs into the project. And then because this was Whitehall and they fucking love bureaucracy, each of these then was given responsibility for different kinds of components within the supply chain, based on a thing called Category 1, 2 or 3. This neatly ensured that basically BAC couldn't source all the bits it wanted independently, or in fact be held account when something failed to deliver, and nor would subcontractors be able to tell BAC that there was a problem within their supply chain without routing communications through the Ministry of Aviation, who were woefully ill-equipped to cope with a dynamic manufacturing set of problems, not, having any business experience whatsoever, and also technically being the customer for all of this. And as the Treasury ultimately controlled the purse strings, every time they had an attack of the collywobbles about the cost, which was basically constantly, all the funding would suddenly dry up, whilst it was considering whether or not it was going to continue to pay for the program, meaning that all the way down this chain, all work either had to stop or companies had to take huge financial risks and continue on the basis that they hoped that they get paid at some point in the future. And through all this, I've been talking about BAC as though that was a thing. But in reality, Vickers, EE and BSEL didn't complete their merger until 1962, over halfway through the program, and did the usual thing, which of course you do when you go through a merger. You merge the management, which meant most of Vickers' senior, supposedly brilliant managers, they left and they went elsewhere. Honestly, this stuff brings me out in a cold sweat. Years later, the TSR2 program was used by BAE Systems, who actually own most of these companies these days, when they were working on the Typhoon project as an example of how not to do collaborative cross-organisational development. And in fairness, they and the UK are now really fucking good at this, partly as a result of the nightmare that was TSR2. All of these problems were uniquely British. However, to add spice was an incredibly stupid 1960s American management school idea, which was called batch production. And basically what this held was that you didn't make prototype aircraft. Instead, you built the first batch of however many planes, and 10 in the case of TSR2 and 14 for the F-111. And you learnt how to manufacture it as you built. And voila, when you'd finished the first dozen or whatever it was, you had the first operational aircraft. No prototypes, no wasted effort, no wasted costs. Provided your first plane was flawless, of course. Because if you did have a problem, then suddenly you were trying to fix not one prototype, but dozens of planes that were already in build. Basically, you multiplied the cost by 10 or 12 or 14 or however many it was. And this was why, for example, the F-111 would struggle so much with redesign, because if, say, you discovered a major flaw in really any system on the first aircraft going through, because you had 11 others or 12 others or how many it was in build, you multiplied that cost, you multiplied that time. And there were many serious problems with both TSR2 and F-111. Eventually, the TSR2 program actually abandoned this process and just put the first 3 through as prototypes in all but name, but it took years to sort out. The F-111 never did. Tired of getting into Twitter fights with North Korean bots over the precise number of rivets in the wing of a P-51A? Want to stop making calls to your ex whilst drunk at 2 a.m? Found yourself browsing model-making websites and about to buy yet another tank that you'll never finish? Well, good news, LordVPN can help. For a reasonable fee each month, my man Jenkins will watch your every move online, carefully draining your bank account of funds, randomly changing your passwords and blocking keywords like the name of your ex from your computer. If you take our enhanced service, he will also infect your phone with malware, which will lock it so that you can only watch my videos. And if all of this fails, then he will turn up at your house and smash your kneecaps with an iron bar to help you focus on the important things in life. Remember, when you can't trust yourself, trust LordVPN. Alright, no, look, I don't actually have a sponsor for this video. It's me asking you to do a thing. I hope you've enjoyed this so far. We're about halfway through now, so do feel free, if you have enjoyed it, to just hit the like button, or to hit the subscribe button, that's even better, or to just simply leave a comment. All of this is helpful, it helps me, and it helps people find this video. Or if you're feeling super keen, you could come and join my Patreon, my Hellfire Club. If you want to join, just go to patreon.com/hardthrasher. Look, there's a link on the screen and everything, and one below in the description. And for £5 a month, I will give you access to our super secret Discord, where there's a community of really rather wonderful people there already, and you get access to these videos early ahead of time. Well, advertising done. Hopefully by this point the kettle has boiled, you've got your cup of tea and your biscuit in front of you. Let's get back to the story. Back in early 1959, under pressure to try and get the dimensions for the aircraft as quickly as possible, discussions began in earnest with BSEL around the engines. BSEL then sort of shuffled their feet and admitted possibly that there had been some kind of a misprint in their brochure, and that the smaller Olympus 15R engines, which on paper should have been powerful enough and economic enough to shift a £75,000 aircraft along quite nicely, well, they couldn't. So that meant going up the range to a pair of 22Rs, also known as M320s if you look them up, which would be much bigger, much hotter, and much heavier. In fact, they cost 3 times more than had been planned. And actually, well, they'd also need to be designed and built as they were not as far advanced as perhaps had been suggested by that brochure. Gosh, those printers just making things up and printing it. If only they'd checked first. Still, never mind crying over spilt milk, eh? We've got 4 years to get this right. Oh, and the 22 hours economy figures. Well, would you believe it? That was also a misprint. That was wrong. So even with them fitted and working as they were going to be built, they would never be able to cover the 1,000 nautical miles that had been specified. Now, this last was a major blow. BAC did their best never to talk about it, but had TSR2 gone into service, it would never have met the specifications that had been called against. By July 1959, TSR2 was weighing in at about £5,000 overweight. That's about £80,000 all up, which was a problem for rough fields and for short takeoffs. It's probably worth saying that when you looked at the early F-111s, they suffered from exactly the same challenge. And the F-111, although it was 10 feet shorter, actually wound up weighing £90,000 at one point. These were big aircraft, like biggerly big. The TSR-2 wound up being nearly 90 feet long, 20 foot longer than a Lancaster bomber. And the F-111 was almost exactly the same length as a B-17. And no matter what English Electric might have tried to claim, or indeed your girlfriend might try to claim, size did and does matter, especially with costs. By November 1959, the TSR2 program had gone from £35 million to £62 million, and this was thought to be an extreme lowball. The Ministry of Aviation was shocked, although honestly, I have no idea why. If TSR2 had delivered 120 aircraft for 62 million quid, it would have been the bargain of the fucking century. Even at its cancellation point in 1965, when the program costs had risen to about £750 million, it was still a steal, no matter what various politicians might have thought. For context, the F-111 program in 1972 would wind up costing £3.2 billion for 167 aircraft, not including maintenance. As the design study progressed through 1960, the team at BAC began to work through the terrain following problem. In a fascinating paper submitted to the Ministry of Aviation, written by a guy called Arnold Reynolds, various potential threats were considered and how the aircraft might deal with them. Reynolds reckoned that it took a system like the British Hawk or the Soviet Guidelines about 40 seconds to acquire an aircraft and fire. It took lightweight systems like the British Rapier about 20 seconds and ultra-lightweight systems based on infrared and things like the British Red Eye about 8 seconds. An aircraft moving at 200 feet, going Mach 0.9 and using terrain following was roughly equivalent to an aircraft going at Mach 2.4 in a straight line at 500 feet. Even then, against what we would think of as manpad threats today, the aircraft needed ideally to be able to sprint to Mach 1.2. Having delivered its weapon, then, it needed to keep up speed and avoid exposing itself. Not like that. And avoiding the blast radius, which would mean probably tossing a bomb about 20 or 30 seconds out from the target and turning tail. It's interesting to note that there was a huge amount of exchange going across the Atlantic here. Cornell Aeronautical Laboratories in the States had been doing their own testing using a B-57 or a Canberra, and BAC had been picking up on that information and doing a lot of exchange visits with them. They then provided a whole bunch of data back to Cornell, and it seems that the systems that were developed for TSR2 by Vickers, English Electric and Cornell then went on to form the basis of what Texas Instruments and Hughes would use to build the F-111's terrain following system. In many ways, the F-111 and TSR2 actually wind up using the same solution to the same problem. We've talked a little bit about the TFX political problems already, and we'll touch on them again, but it really was as nothing compared to the challenges that the TSR2 faced. Behind the scenes, Lord Mountbatten, as I mentioned earlier, Chief of the Defence Staff, and Field Marshal Sir Francis Festing, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, both had lost all faith in the programme ever working, and not without cause. From the outside it looked like a bugger's muddle. It was plagued with near continual technical problems. Mountbatten took to bringing along to any meeting he went to 5 Buccaneer pictures and 1 picture of a TSR2, slamming them down on the table and saying, 5 of these now, or you might get one of those at some point and you don't know what it's going to cost. And this worked. Political support, always shaky to start with, began to crumble. By 1960, it was really obvious that the aircraft would not enter service any time in 1964 or come to that 65, nor would it cost the originally projected £1.2 million per airframe. By 1963, the project costs had ballooned to between £175 million and £200 million plus £2.3 million per aircraft, roughly 6 times the originally projected cost, and there was no guarantee that this figure wouldn't continue to climb. In fact, the per unit cost in 1964 crept up to £2.8 million per airframe, and the total cost for the project to around £500 million. That's about $13.5 billion in modern money. That's actually not bad value, but it was seen as shocking back in the day. And for this money, service entry was now predicted not earlier than 1969. But the aircraft remained the only game in town, and RAF support at this point was unwavering, partly because on September the 27th, 1964, TSR-2 finally flew. Just. Embarrassingly for the British, the US YF-111A flew just weeks later at Fort Worth on December the 21st, 1964, having started procurement 3 years later. The TSR program had never had great PR for reasons of national security and probably because of acute embarrassment. No pictures, no progress photos, no artists' impressions, no mock-ups were ever put out into the public. No one knew what the hell this fucking thing was that was costing so much, least of all potential customers. The Australians, who'd been really keen to get involved and to buy up to 50 aircraft, were completely kept in the dark by the British government, despite BAC's representatives begging for help. Unsurprisingly, Canberra got pretty pissed off and it opened talks with the US about buying into the TFX program instead. Far too late, the British government realised that they'd fucked this all up by just assuming that the Aussies would favour the British solution and tried to recover the problem in October of '63 with a PR blitz, but it failed epically. They offered technical input, some Valiant bombers as a bit of a stopgap, and a program cost of about 48 million quid. But the TFX gave the Aussies pretty much all that, plus a cheaper unit cost, and the time for talk was over. They got an offer which said that they could have the airframes for $48 million plus 2.3 per airframe, and they took the deal. This was a total cock-up by a complacent Whitehall rather than the oft-lauded American duplicity which did for TSR-2 in RAAF colours. This was a serious issue. Suddenly, unit costs would go up and the program costs would fall solely on the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, the Germans, Iranians, French, and even at one point the Americans came and went as potential buyers, but they were all thwarted by political considerations, costs, and above all, secrecy, and in America's case, the hope that TFX would still produce a joint naval and air force option. None of this would have killed the project were it not for the RAF finally losing faith. They'd been doing some thinking. They'd looked at the costs and they were beginning to have doubts. In October of 1964, they issued a damning internal report. A serious war in Europe was, in their opinion, unlikely to break out, and if it did in an era of ICBMs, then the role of a tactical nuclear bomber was, at best, unclear. In a conventional role, TSR-2 was thought of as being next to useless. Its recon function had been replaced with other assets, and it was, in any case, years behind. The all-weather systems didn't work and appeared not to be able to be made to work. The navigation system was fundamentally flawed, and it relied on radar emissions, which might well make the aircraft much more vulnerable than anybody had realised when they first started out. And also, they might not work outside anywhere except northwest Europe. The aircraft couldn't cope with the rough fields that it was supposed to be able to fly off, and its huge undercarriage was therefore optimised for completely the wrong thing, rendering all that space and cost and engineering largely redundant. The wing shape was causing serious concerns as it appeared that it might not be suitable for heavier stores, and on and on and on. It made for very painful reading. In short, they had an aircraft on the books which could not meet the original 339 specifications, and it might never be able to meet them. The RAF might not have wanted it even if it had been able to meet them, because they needed now a medium-range conventional bomber flexible enough to hit targets at low level, but where speed perhaps wasn't such a huge consideration so much as operational flexibility. And it was still at least 4 years away from entering service. Now, not all of this, in fairness, was completely true about the programme, but a lot of it was, and the last political prop, which had really been holding up TSR-2 for all this time, fell away. On the 15th of October, days after this report was published, the Labour Party won the general election, and they came and had a look under the hood of the project. BAC was not responding to fresh estimates for cost. Figures as high as £1 billion were now being bandied around. That's about 26 billion in today's money, and the axe was swung. On the 1st of April 1965, the TSR-2 program was finally cancelled. It has been said over the years that TSR-2 was cancelled because of a government that didn't understand it and didn't want it for political reasons. It's also said, often very loudly, that the Americans exerted some kind of undue influence on the British and that other governments had considered TSR-2 as a solution. None of these statements is true. TSR-2 was cancelled because it didn't work. That, as a Brit, is a pretty painful thing to say, but I'm afraid it's true. Key systems essential to taking the airframe from semi-functional to operational were nowhere near ready. Indeed, several of them needed scrapping and starting again, and it remained basically still theoretical in 1965. This will make some folks incredibly upset, but let me be really specific about what was missing, where, why, and what the proposed fix was at the time. The pictures of TSR-2 flying sometimes give people a false impression of what had been done. Let's talk a little bit about what you can't see in those photographs in 64 and 65. The idea, as we said here at the start, was to have an automatic terrain following system. This never worked. In fact, the complete assembly never flew in TSR-2, never mind actually functioning. Years of delays in placing contracts by the Ministry of Aviation, who had these Category 1 components in their control, and then attempts then to try and compete everything endlessly in the name of savings, had actually made the real technical guts of the aircraft much more expensive and arrive much more slowly, and they just weren't there in 65. The Automatic Flight Control Systems, or AFCS, that was the heart of the terrain-following capability, was horrifically complicated, with hundreds of sensors and batteries and circuits and 3 different radar suites, all of which needed to work together. The complete system, pretty much as designed, was put into the 4th aircraft to be built, but in 1965 it was a long way from operational. Months, if not years, of testing and refinement was still required. And whilst Vickers felt that any basic design flaws had been removed, no one could really guarantee that something wouldn't be uncovered. The Central Compute System, or CCS, which were supposed to run it and everything else, had 2 Verdun computers, each of which weighed 85 pounds, running at 332.8 Hz with a combined memory of 2,048 words. Now, this was bleeding-edge stuff, 20 years ahead of its time, but it was nowhere near enough for the tasks that had been set. The problem was that the update speed on the CCS simply couldn't cope with the number of parameters that it was being fed for decision-making. In fact, the Verduns were probably 2 to 4 times too small for what was needed. As a result, in late 1964, a totally different architecture was under consideration, meaning again that the TSR-2 flew without the core operating functionality that was supposed to define the aircraft's capability. Compute costs, quoted at around £2.2 million originally, were by November 1964 up at £4.7 million, and that was before this major rethink had happened. In essence, this meant that the plane could not perform its core function when it was cancelled. Terrain following is very hard, even today. In 1968, a total of 8 F-111As were sent to Thailand to take part in combat readiness exercises, flying against targets in Vietnam under a program called Combat Lancer. 1 airframe was lost to catastrophic structural issues, and 2 almost certainly to TFR failing, or being switched off by pilots because it was failing, who then went into the scenery under manual control. And much as I like to think that the British always do things better, it seems highly improbable that this system would ever have worked as intended on TSR-2. A less obvious but no less serious a problem was how you set the aircraft up to go and complete the mission. We're talking pre-GPS, so somehow you needed to engage with the navigation and attack system on the ground, be able to set it up the right way, and kind of put through all the data that it was going to be needed. This is known as self-checking or checking out. This was essential, especially if you deployed from a forward airbase, as it would allow the aircraft to ensure basically it set all its nav systems up before takeoff, and so a special air transportable external system and cabling attachment for TSR-2 was designed to feed data locally to the nav attack system. This unit became known as the Mobile Automatic Checkout System, or MACE, and it was a huge problem. In 1965, it was nowhere near complete, and the cost and time estimates to get it operational were huge. The entire budget that had been spent on nav and attack so far was basically going to need to be spent again. It was years from readiness. In other words, the aircraft's brains, even if they were made operational, were likely to fail in the field in 1965, and that just assumes that it was deployed in Northwest Europe. Deployment anywhere else in the world would have required a bespoke program rewrite. It was doable, but again, cost was a problem. Given time and money and advances in computer science, the chances of all this could have been fixed by, let's say 1970, but that was far too late for the program. Despite 24 flights, TSR-2 was in reality a shell in 1965. As I said before, it was years away from being able to fulfill the brief, even if the engines hadn't kept exploding. which they did. The 22R engines developed by Bristol Sydney had huge problems throughout the programme. They were heavier than they should have been, and they were prone to catastrophic failure. At least 3 are thought to have exploded, including one that burnt the testbed Vulcan that it was attached to the ground on the 3rd of December 1962. For the first test flights, the 22Rs were limited to 98% of thrust, and they then only had one afterburning run, which was done on a single engine. A final report on the Olympus 22 development was published, but to be honest, I haven't actually managed to get hold of it. If anybody's got a copy and wants to post it, I'll make sure it's linked in the description. I've read a summary, and there's no question that the engines were theoretically powerful, but no one had much experience with reheated turbofans, and it was probably still years from a proper resolution when the program was cancelled. In fairness, reheat turbofans proved far more difficult generally than anybody had realised when they were first conceptualised. The TF-30s on the F-111 never really worked as advertised either, and they too exploded regularly on test stands for a number of years. Added to all of this, there had also been serious concerns about the undercarriage from fairly early on, and when it did fly on the 27th of December 1964, it did so with the wheels down because they couldn't be retracted. On the 5th and 7th flights, vibrations threatened to destroy the entire airframe. By the time the plug was pulled, various jury rigs and temporary fixes had been tried, but no permanent solution had been put forward, and it was quite likely that a total redesign of the entire undercarriage was going to be required. Many things did work, and for example the Low Altitude Bomb System, or LABS, which was a joint US-UK project, got to the point pretty early that it could get a bullpup guided bomb onto a target with a 50% CEP of 30 feet. This is pretty incredible, even in the era of modern laser-guided weapons. And although I don't know this for sure, I think given that Ferranti and Hughes both worked on it as prime contractors under Vickers, they probably also put the same stuff into the F-111. A lot of what went into TSR2, one way or another, wound up forming the basics for the Aardvark's brain. The surprising thing here perhaps isn't that TSR2 was cancelled so much as that the F-111 survived. Indeed, it's remembered by aviation enthusiasts today with a great deal of fondness, despite having been at almost every turn a bit of a failure. On the 15th of May 1967, 3 years after the cancellation of the TSR2 project, the F-111A was finally approved for production. However, costs and problems with it continued to spiral out of control and would do for the whole of its life. The problems for the Vark are extensive when you actually sit down and look at it. I mean, we talked about Combat Lancer a minute ago. That was the combat deployment of 6 airframes in 1968. Now, actually, 2 more were sent out as well. They suffered 50% losses on 55 sorties. That's just not good enough for your new multi-billion-dollar jet. Things got worse in lots of different ways. The F-111A was prone to stalling for basically its entire operational career, despite vast efforts going in to try and sort out the engines and the air intakes, and $250 million being spent on the problem. They kind of conquered it by the 80s, but really it wasn't good enough, and in the 1960s and 70s it was a real issue. And part of this, of course, was caused by the batch production issues we mentioned at the beginning of this, which meant that costs leapt up whenever there was an issue. Worse, total production, originally projected at over 2,500 aircraft when you included the Navy, was cut to just 430, which meant a skyrocketing unit cost. Wags in the press began to refer to TFX as being terrible fucking experience, and by the time that the Navy gave up on the TFX-N or the F-111B, depending on which flavour you prefer, the commonality with the A version was down to less than 30%, i.e. not much at all when you consider the original purpose of the program, but it still had things like the side-by-side cockpit, the escape capsule and so on that they'd insisted on, which are now baked in and served just to make the aircraft bigger and heavier and more expensive. McNamara then pushed Strategic Air Command to try and rescue this commonality issue and adopt the F-111 as the FB-111A, the B being added to try and save Sachs face so that they could call it a bomber. I mean, I don't know why that matters, but it did a lot at the time. There's a huge amount of wrangling. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This was supposed to create about 263 new FB variants, which would add to the total. But in fact, they only built 76 of them, and they cost $1.2 billion, or 700% of the proposed price per airframe. Nice. Problems continued to plague the F-111 program. In 1968, tail rod weld issues grounded the fleet following Combat Lancer. In 1969, there were crashes because of fuel handling problems, wings shearing off under load, and multiple system failures. In 1972, further combat trials were conducted, resulting in further losses, probably again related to the terrain following system, as well as constant serviceability challenges, gremlins in the electrics, ECM systems that couldn't jam the Soviet ZS Youth-23 guns, and so on and so on and so on. Back in 1964, the base cost per unit for the F-111 was supposed to be around $3.5 million when it was put forward, but it wound up costing $13.5 million across the A's, D's and E's, much more for the FB version, and then again more for the specialist electronic warfare version, the Raven. The Aussies wound up buying the C version for $90 million. That was twice what they'd been quoted back in 1963, and they'd had to wait 10 years for them. In early 1968, when they cancelled TSR2, the British were offered the same deal, but they found to their horror that 50 F-111Ks that they would order in fact would not cost the £100 million that they'd assumed, but £425 million, probably actually not far off what it would have cost to finish the TSR2 programme. And they withdrew in 1968, having spent 35 million quid on thin air, with most of those airframes getting converted into FB-111As. Well done, UK government, again. Serviceability problems across the whole lifetime of the F-111, even in the late model F-111F, was shockingly bad. Perhaps as few as 23 airframes were ever ready for frontline service at one time. Probably the most famous and nastiest maintenance problem came with the Australian F-111Cs, where the RAAF fitters were forced into very cramped spaces using brutally corrosive chemicals to deseal and then reseal fuel tanks. A board of inquiry in 2001 showed how issues in production quality and a lack of forethought, as well as RAAF negligence, had played into a problem with over 400 fitters suffering serious, life-changing, long-term health problems as a result. Technically, the F-111 had actually entered into service in 1964, 3 years before the type was approved, but it wasn't until 1971 that the first fully operational squadrons of F-111s were actually ready in the US form, and 1972 for the Aussies. All right, I've been pretty rude about the F-111. Let me balm some of those burns, because let's be clear, the crews that flew it absolutely fucking loved the pig. They loved how fast they could make this bird going with just a little bit of coaxing. Allegedly, one crew could got it up to Mach 3. I think that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but it tells you about how quick they could get it to go. Crews found that for a 23-ton airframe, it was incredibly agile. It was very comfortable to fly, it was smooth to operate, and provided that the pilot was careful with the throttles, fast as fuck. Plus, it could shoot flames out of its arse for some reason. I mean, what's not to like? I saw one as a kid at an air show do this, and I nearly wet myself with excitement. The side-by-side arrangement gave a really comradely environment to the aircrew, and they could begin to bond as a team. And for navigators and bombardiers of SAC, they could suddenly, see out of the aircraft, which was a bit of a revelation. Planners got a handle on how to use it down low to drop stores with little or no warning, or up high as a sensor platform, but of course it came into its pomp in the mid-1980s, and that really meant it was a bit tricky to use operationally, because things like the F-117A, the Nighthawk, were beginning to show that there was an alternative to speed, and that of course was stealth. And then you got things like the B-1B, the Lancer, which could go down and do the nuclear stuff real low if it needed to, at similar speeds. Nonetheless, the F-111 has a reputation, and I think rightfully so, as a very, very cool conceptual plane. It's just the execution was a bit tricky. I haven't really talked about later operations like Libya in 1986 or Desert Storm in 1991. They did do important work in both, but they continued to prove to be operationally fragile. It's kind of hard to put one's finger on what an F-111 could do that couldn't be done by another platform, probably at least as well or even slightly better. I've been thinking about what analogy one could draw for the whole concept of these late 1950s strike bombers, and the best thing I can come up with for having an F-111 or a TSR-2 in the 1970s and 80s, it was a bit like owning a Citroen DS in the same period. You might not know what that was. Rather than accidentally summoning Intergalactic Bin Man and adding over an hour to this video, let's summarise by saying that the DS was, in 1955, the most advanced car in the world bar none. It had the kinds of features that were undreamt of by other manufacturers at the time. Powered disc brakes, a semi-automatic gearbox, hyperneumatic suspension, power steering, a heated front windscreen, a form of traction control, crumple zones. This was all amazing stuff, and according to Citroen, it was going to sell millions and millions of units every year. And of course, it didn't. In 1955, it sold 60, and 20 years later, when they finished the production run, it had sold perhaps 1.4 million in total. Unsurprisingly, they broke down a lot. They cost a fortune to maintain. Most of the key selling points did not, work, and they were manufactured in France by French workers primarily interested in protecting their own jobs, and owners were often left flat broke and wondering what exactly the DS was for. It wasn't the best at anything. It wasn't even unique anymore. It did have very nice ride quality though. Well, look, I know that was rather a long video, and I thank you for sticking around until the end. You are very, very kind to have listened and heard me out. Hopefully you're not shouting too emphatically at your computer screen. Jenkins will be along in a moment with a drink for those of you that would like one. Please do feel free to hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you wish to shout at me, you can, of course. I've got an email address. It's lord.hardthrasher@gmail.com, or you can find me in versions of Hard Thrasher at X or Twitter, whatever the fuck you want to call it this week, Blue Sky, Instagram. God, I'm even on TikTok, you can do that too. But until then, I think we'd better leave this alone and let you return to your viewing pleasures elsewhere. Thank you so much for having joined us. Now get off my property.